Imagine a time when the throne of England wasn't just a symbol of power, it was a prize worth killing for. A time when family ties meant nothing, and betrayal was just another tool in the game of kings. What would you do to wear the crown? Would you betray your own blood? Start a war that would last decades? That's exactly what happened during the Wars of the Roses, a bloody, brutal conflict that tore England apart for over 30 years. This wasn't just a war between armies. It was a war between families, the House of Lancaster and the House of York, two branches of the same royal tree, both claiming they had the right to rule. But this story isn't just about kings and queens. It's about ambition, betrayal, and the lengths people will go to for power. By the end of it, England would never be the same. So, how did it all begin? And why does this centuries-old conflict still fascinate us today? Let's dive into the chaos, the drama, and the bloodshed of the Wars of the Roses. To understand the Wars of the Roses, we need to go back to where it all started, the roots of the conflict. It begins with two powerful families, the House of Lancaster and the House of York. Both were branches of the Plantagenet dynasty, descendants of King Edward III. But here's the twist. Both families believed they had the rightful claim to the English throne. The Lancasters, represented by the Red Rose, were led by King Henry VI. On the other side, the Yorks, symbolized by the White Rose, were led by Richard, Duke of York. Now you'd think being king would give Henry VI the upper hand, but here's the problem. Henry wasn't exactly the strong, decisive leader England needed. Henry VI was, well, let's just say he wasn't cut out for the job. He was more interested in religion and books than ruling a kingdom. His weak leadership led to widespread discontent. England was drowning in debt, corruption was rampant, and the nobility was restless. To make matters worse, Henry suffered from bouts of mental illness, leaving the country effectively leaderless for long periods. Enter Richard, Duke of York. He was a powerful and ambitious man who believed he could do a better job running the country. And he wasn't alone. Many nobles agreed with him. Tension simmered for years, but in 1455, everything boiled over. The first major clash happened at the Battle of St. Albans. It wasn't just a skirmish. It was the spark that ignited a full-blown war. The Yorks won this first battle, but it was far from over. This was just the beginning of a decades-long struggle that would see kings rise and fall, families torn apart, and England drenched in blood. So, what happened next? How did this family feud spiral into one of the most brutal wars in English history? Stick around, because the drama is just getting started. Now let's meet the key players in this deadly game of thrones. These weren't just faceless nobles. They were real people with ambitions, fears, and a burning desire to rule. First up, we have Henry VI, the Lancaster king. As we've already seen, Henry wasn't exactly a powerhouse. He was pious, gentle, and, frankly, out of his depth. His inability to rule effectively made him a target for those who believed they could do better. Enter Richard, Duke of York. Ambitious, calculating, and fiercely determined, Richard believed the throne was rightfully his. He wasn't just fighting for power. He was fighting for what he saw as justice. The Yorks had a strong claim to the throne, and Richard wasn't about to let Henry's weak rule ruin England. But Richard wasn't the only York with big ambitions. His son, Edward IV, would become one of the most charismatic and ruthless figures of the Wars of the Roses. Edward was young, bold, and a natural leader. He didn't just want the throne. He believed he was destined to rule. And when he took the crown in 1461, it seemed like the Yorks had finally won. But wait, there's one more figure we can't ignore. Richard III, Edward's younger brother. Richard is one of history's most controversial figures. Was he a power-hungry villain who would stop at nothing to seize the throne? Or was he a misunderstood leader trying to hold a fractured kingdom together? Either way, his actions would change the course of English history forever. So why were these men willing to fight to the death? It wasn't just about power, it was about legacy. To them, the throne wasn't just a seat of authority. It was a symbol of divine right, family honor, and national stability. They believed that only they could save England from chaos, and that belief drove them to do whatever it took to win, even if it meant tearing the country apart in the process. But this wasn't just a man's game. Behind the scenes, powerful women were pulling the strings, shaping the course of the war in ways you might not expect. But we'll get to that later. For now, let's dive into the battles that defined this brutal conflict. The Wars of the Roses weren't just a single battle. They were a series of brutal clashes that shifted the balance of power over and over again. Let's break down some of the most important ones. It all began in 1455 with the Battle of St. Albans. That was the first major clash between the Lancasters and the Yorks. Richard of York and his allies faced off against Henry VI's forces. The Yorks won decisively, and for a moment it seemed like they might take control. But this was just the opening act. Fast forward to 1461, and we get to the Battle of Towton, one of the bloodiest battles in English history. This was a showdown between Edward IV, Richard of York's son, and the Lancastrian forces. The fighting was brutal, with snow on the ground and soldiers slipping in the mud. Edward emerged victorious, and the Yorks took the throne. But the Lancasters weren't done yet. In 1471, the Battle of Tewkesbury became a turning point. Edward IV faced off against the Lancastrians once again, led by Henry VI's wife, Margaret of Anjou. This time, the Yorks crushed their enemies. Henry VI's son, Edward of Westminster, was killed in the battle, and Henry himself died shortly after, likely murdered. With the Lancastrian line nearly wiped out, it seemed like the Yorks had finally won. But here's the thing about the Wars of the Roses. Just when you thought one side had won, everything could change. Betrayals and shifting alliances kept the conflict alive. Nobles switched sides, promises were broken, and loyalties were tested. For example, the Earl of Warwick, once a staunch Yorkist ally, turned against Edward IV and briefly restored Henry VI to the throne. It was chaos, a constant tug-of-war for power. And then there's the ultimate betrayal, Richard III's rise to power. After Edward IV's death, Richard declared Edward's sons illegitimate and took the throne for himself. This move shocked the nation and set the stage for the final act of the Wars of the Roses. So, what happened next? How did this decades-long conflict finally come to an end? Stick around, because the story is about to take one last dramatic turn. When we think of the Wars of the Roses, we often picture kings and knights clashing on the battlefield. But behind the scenes, some of the most influential players were women. These weren't just passive observers. They were power brokers, strategists, and survivors who shaped the course of the war in ways you might not expect. Let's start with Margaret of Anjou, the fierce and determined queen of Henry VI. While Henry was often indecisive and plagued by illness, Margaret stepped up to lead the Lancastrian cause. She was relentless, rallying armies, negotiating alliances, and even leading troops into battle. Margaret wasn't just fighting for her husband's throne. She was fighting for her son's future. Her determination kept the Lancastrian cause alive long after many would have given up. On the other side, we have Elizabeth Woodville, the wife of Edward IV. Elizabeth was a commoner who married a king, and her rise to power was nothing short of extraordinary. But she wasn't just a romantic figure. She was a shrewd political operator. Elizabeth used her influence to secure positions for her family, which angered many nobles and fueled tensions within the Yorkist camp. Her marriage to Edward IV also brought the Woodvilles into the heart of English politics, creating new alliances and new enemies. These women didn't just sit back and watch. They actively shaped the course of the war. Margaret's relentless campaigning kept the Lancastrians in the fight, while Elizabeth's influence helped solidify Edward IV's reign. But their actions also had consequences. Margaret's aggressive tactics made her enemies, and Elizabeth's favoritism toward her family sowed discord among the Yorkists. And let's not forget the role of other women, like Anne Neville, who married Richard III, and Cecily Neville, the mother of Edward IV and Richard III. These women navigated a dangerous world of shifting loyalties and political intrigue, using their wits and connections to protect their families and advance their causes. The Wars of the Roses weren't just a man's game. Women played a crucial role in shaping the conflict, proving that power isn't always won on the battlefield. Sometimes it's won in the shadows, through alliances, strategy, and sheer determination. But as the war dragged on, it became clear that England needed a new beginning. And that's where Henry Tudor comes in, a man who would change everything. But we'll get to that in a moment. By 1485, England was exhausted. Decades of war had left the country divided and desperate for stability. Enter Henry Tudor, a relatively unknown figure with a claim to the throne through his Lancastrian heritage. Henry had been living in exile, but he saw an opportunity to end the chaos once and for all. The final showdown came at the Battle of Bosworth field. Henry's forces faced off against Richard III, the Yorkist king. Richard was a seasoned warrior, but his reign was controversial, and many nobles had turned against him. The battle was fierce, but in the end, Henry emerged victorious. Richard III was killed on the battlefield, becoming the last English king to die in combat. With Richard's death, the Wars of the Roses finally came to an end. But Henry didn't just win the throne. He took a crucial step to ensure peace. He married Elizabeth of York, the daughter of Edward IV. This marriage wasn't just a romantic gesture. It was a political masterstroke. By uniting the red rose of Lancaster with the white rose of York, Henry symbolically brought the two warring houses together. This union didn't just end the conflict. It laid the foundation for a new dynasty, the Tudors. Henry VII, as he became known, worked tirelessly to rebuild England and strengthen the monarchy. His reign marked the beginning of a new era, one that would see England rise as a major European power. The Wars of the Roses were over, But their legacy lived on. The Tudors would go on to produce some of England's most famous monarchs, including Henry VIII and Elizabeth I. And it all started with Henry Tudor's victory at Bosworth and his marriage to Elizabeth of York, a union that finally brought peace to a fractured kingdom. The Wars of the Roses didn't just end with the rise of the Tudors. They left a lasting mark on England's monarchy, society, and even its culture. Let's start with the monarchy. Before the wars, the king's power was often challenged by powerful nobles. But Henry VII changed that. He centralized power, weakened the nobility, and created a stronger, more stable monarchy. This shift laid the groundwork for the absolute rule of later Tudor monarchs like Henry VIII and Elizabeth I. But the impact wasn't just political, it was social too. Decades of war had devastated the English countryside, and many noble families were wiped out or weakened. This created space for new families to rise, and it also shifted power dynamics within English society. The wars also highlighted the dangers of weak leadership and the importance of a strong, centralized government, lessons that would shape England's future. And then there's the cultural legacy. The Wars of the Roses have inspired countless stories, plays, and novels. William Shakespeare immortalized the conflict in plays like Henry VI and Richard III, painting vivid portraits of ambition, betrayal, and tragedy. These works have kept the memory of the wars alive for centuries. But the influence doesn't stop there. If you've ever watched Game of Thrones, you've seen the Wars of the Roses reimagined on screen. George R.R. Martin, the author of the books that inspired the show, has openly admitted that the conflict between the Starks and the Lannisters was heavily influenced by the Lancasters and Yorks. The themes of power, family, and betrayal are timeless, and they continue to captivate audiences today. So, while the Wars of the Roses ended over 500 years ago, their legacy lives on in the way we think about power, in the stories we tell, and in the lessons we learn from history. It's a reminder that even the bloodiest conflicts can shape the future in ways no one could have imagined. The Wars of the Roses teach us a powerful lesson. The pursuit of power comes at a cost. For over 30 years, England was torn apart by ambition, betrayal, and bloodshed. Families were destroyed, lives were lost, and the country was left in ruins, all for the sake of a crown. It's a stark reminder that power, no matter how glittering, often comes with a heavy price. But from the ashes of this conflict rose a new era, the Tudor dynasty, that would shape England's future in ways no one could have predicted. It's a story of resilience, transformation, and the enduring human spirit. If you found this dive into history as fascinating as I did, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into the past. History isn't just about dates and battles. It's about the people, the drama, and the lessons we can still learn today. Let me know in the comments, what do you think was the most shocking moment of the Wars of the Roses? Or, which historical figure would you want to learn more about? Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Until then, stay curious.